This is some data from the REN 21 report, which the Worldwatch staff is really heavily involved in developing. So it's a global status report on renewable energy and renewable energy investment. And as you can see, this shows annual growth rates of renewable energy capacity from 2005 to 2010, and then also the yellow is 2010 alone. So as you can see, renewable energy capacity is growing very fast and faster. I guess fossil fuels aren't here, but they're down on this end of annual growth rate. So solar PV grew by 72% in 2010, and grid connected even faster. Concentrating solar power. So just some really positive signs, but unfortunately, since we're starting from much lower existing capacities, this growth isn't happening fast enough to really make a difference in terms of the renewable generation that we're seeing, and fossil fuel is still heavily dominant in the global energy.
So I'm going to speak more generally about our sustainable energy roadmaps and sort of talk a little bit about the meat that goes into it. So if you could switch to next slide. These are sort of the fundamental pillars of our roadmap work. And what's very interesting about it is it's sort of, you go clockwise, starting at the top of energy efficiency. That's very much how we organize our roadmaps. And it begins with just a very sort of concrete assessment of the energy efficiency and renewable energy potentials in these different countries. And what we do is we contract with a GIS mapping company called 3Tier, which has actually provided us with solar and wind resource assessments in all 3 Caribbean countries where we're working. And we also have partnered with additional people in hydro assessments. We've looked into waste to energy, and we analyze all those things and energy efficiency measures like building codes or new technologies that you can install in buildings to reduce energy use. We analyze that, and after the first 2 chapters there, we sort of look at things in the broader picture of how you can integrate them into the grid and get sort of more of a technical assessment, because even if you have an incredible amount of potential, you need a grid that can handle that. So we realize that's very important, but we have to identify the potential before we can then look into the grid. Then we do sort of a socioeconomic analysis, which very largely depends on these first 3 pillars right here, where if you have very strong potential, it sort of enables you to produce at a lower cost. And then the socioeconomic analysis and all the potential sort of drive the policy assessment. It allows you to sort of see where you can sort of aim your policy measures, what policies you should try to develop to bring the most efficient renewable energies onto the grid. And then finally we end with looking at financial options that these countries have. Whether it's international funding, domestic banks, there are a lot of different opportunities out there to fund these renewable energies. And we sort of try and highlight all the different opportunities that these countries have. You can go to the next slide. So what I'm going to do here in this presentation is mostly focus on 2 of those pillars, which are the actual resource assessments and the socioeconomic assessment, just because that's I do more of the technical type stuff, while people like Shaq's very into the policy and financial stuff. So here, a very exciting thing that recently happened. We just presented our first roadmap in the Dominican Republic about 3 weeks ago. And here's an actual map of the wind potential in the Dominican Republic. And basically, the more red or yellow that it is in a certain area, the better wind potential there is. And this is a map that comes from 3Tier company. They use a numerical weather prediction model to generate these maps. And at this point, it's for the national maps, it's at a 5-kilometer resolution. But what we do is we use these general national maps to sort of zone in on areas that have very high potential. For example, right here. And we can do sort of a more focused assessment at about a 200-meter resolution, which gives you a very good idea of where wind potential is very strong. And then from there, that's when you put up anemometers and you go into sort of wind development. You can go to the next slide.
Matt, excuse me, Matt,
yes.
please forgive my ignorance, but what's the scale of that?
Sorry,
so how I don't know the Dominican Republic very well. How large an area is that cover?
Trying to think what it's similar to in the United States. Maybe like the size of
and so
New Jersey or something.
Whereabouts on that are the capital cities? Are they close to the wind areas?
So Santo Domingo is down around here. Santiago, which is the second largest city, is up here towards the north. But yeah, a lot of the population is sort of concentrated in this area right here. And conveniently, there is some pretty strong potential there. Yes?
How do you get these maps through satellite?
Yes. Well, no. Then there's so it uses this model called a numerical weather prediction model, and it uses sort of past weather trends from the past 15 or 20 years. A lot of this comes from things like NASA and that, where they've made data publicly available. And you have these GIS mapping companies that have relationships with these big institutes like NASA and can use their data and sort of, obviously it doesn't mean like this is what the wind potential will be tomorrow or next year, because it's using historical data. I mean, you're predicting the future kind of. But they try and use a very long period of time to make up for any strange years that might have occurred or something. But in the next map, the solar map, what they're using here is also sort of past recorded data in the past 15 or 20 years from satellite imagery and that type of stuff. What's different about the wind models is that it is a little bit more of a prediction and hypothetical situation, more so than solar. Like, it actually is a model. While this is showing just kind of average numbers from the past 15 plus years, it spits out. I can send you the text of, there's pretty technical text about how all this is done, but we can talk about that later. So this is the general national solar map for the Dominican Republic. And this is direct normal irradiance, which is basically the radiation that comes directly from the sun. And this is what is most applicable to concentrating solar power. So for example, if you see a lot of, again, the yellow or red means very high potential. If you see blue here, what that means is, obviously the sun shines a lot in these Caribbean countries, but there are more cloud formations here. Dominican Republic's actually pretty famous for a lot of their, maybe not as much as Costa Rica or something, but they have cloud forests there. And that's where a lot of these are located. But basically, what this shows is where you can set up CSP installations. And if you go to the next slide, I couldn't actually find when I was preparing for this, the global horizontal irradiance map for the Dominican Republic, but like Shaq works in Jamaica, I work with Haiti mostly, so I'm just using the Haiti map here, which is a part of the same island as the DR, so it's fairly similar. And you can see when you're looking at global horizontal irradiance, what that is it's sort of it's the direct normal irradiance with the diffuse horizontal irradiance, so the past map plus solar irradiation that goes through a cloud and gets deflected or something. This is those two together, and that's what solar PV panels use to generate electricity. So this is, in today's world, probably a little bit more important because PV is sort of the technology that seems to be taking off more. But as you can see, there's an incredible resource here in these countries. If you compare it to Germany, the largest solar PV producer in the world, Germany is like blue everywhere, but they've just managed to do it through good policies. But this just highlights how great the potential is in these countries. No?
Just
Yes?
a comment about PV. The average lifespan of photovoltaic panels is 20 years, which for industrial purposes is kind of limiting, because as a government you cannot invest hundreds of millions in large-scale PV plants, knowing that you're gonna have to replace those panels because of sand erosion, because just they deteriorate over time. And so if judging from Moko's experience, CSP seems to be the more prevalent mature technology out there rather than PV. But I understand that in Germany they're using PV.
And I agree with you. Sorry if you misinterpreted what I said, or I said it the wrong way. I support CSP, and we address it in our reports. The major problem with CSP in these countries is that water is pretty scarce there, and CSP does require more water. These are relatively small islands, and especially in Haiti, they have a problem often providing even fresh water to its citizens all the time. So it becomes sort of a competing factor. You don't want to install technologies that might take water away from populations that need it. But yes, CSP does have strong potential.
It's true. Just for your information, we met a gentleman from the Stellar Group, and he about how CSP can be implemented using almost no water. It seems it's a technology that the U.S. Army is using.
Okay. Well, that'd be interesting. We can talk later about that. We go to the next slide. Another thing that we do is with REACH here, they also sort of map. It's not just they provide these general maps about what is the average potential over a year, kilowatt hours per meter squared per day, but they give us daily sort of projections on how much solar or wind you can produce. And as you can see, there is sort of some seasonality fluctuations. And what you can do here is sort of find maybe different wind farms that can complement each other well, or you can say, oh, well, wind seems to be producing a lot during the summer months, and maybe hydro isn't as strong then, but hydro is stronger in these months. And how can you sort of build to installation solar, or in this case, I think it is wind. How can you build wind and hydro next to each other that might be producing at different times of the year, so it sort of acts together as kind of like one baseload system, but not quite. You go to the next slide. So here's also obviously things change daily too. So this is diurnal variation. And again, what you look for here is, different wind farms might be producing at different rates every day, depending on the hour. And you try and look for suitable complementary technologies. So obviously the blue one here, Monte Cristi, is producing a lot sort of at the later night time. So you can say, oh, if this is near a solar farmer or something, which is peaking around here, then maybe they could complement each other very well. Next slide.
And I just, the black line is interesting because it's the average of all of the power generation from all of them. So whereas the individual lines kind of peak and valley, the black line is relatively flat. So you can see how you can get a pretty steady power generation.
Yeah, and if you have a very strong grid that is very well interconnected, if you installed all of these, there really wouldn't be too many peaks and valleys. It would be relatively smooth. Obviously, there would still be troubles, but this does highlight how, even if there is variability in wind, if you build smartly, you can figure out ways that sort of make it a little more flat than some people would accuse wind of being. Yes?
This is solar power or wind power?
This is wind, yes. Yeah. Sorry. We have other maps for solar too, but we can only include so much. So this is one of the last slides that we have, and this is sort of we're now doing this LC, or levelized cost of electricity model, just to highlight how relatively cheap to some extent developing renewable energies is in these countries. A lot of island states, even if you look in the United States, Hawaii pays way more for electricity than basically any other state in the United States, just because it's very remote, it's middle of nowhere. These are small states that normally don't have traditional fossil fuels that they can just burn, so they often import things from really far away, and it's just very expensive. And a lot of these countries have the same problems. And for example, in Jamaica, the base rate is 38 cents per kilowatt hour or so, which is incredible. In the Dominican Republic, it's about 25 cents. So almost anything is competitive to some degree in these countries. But this just highlights how when you take into account sort of all the initial capital costs, the fuel costs, what we've also tried to incorporate in this LCOE model. So it's a model that the World Bank has produced through its SMAP program. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. It's called the meta model. But we're sort of one of their pilot programs, I guess, in trying to bring this new model they've developed into real publications. But it includes environmental costs. So you can assign a price per ton of CO2. You can factor in different particulate matter costs and all that. So we've done that, and what's really incredible, these are statistics for Jamaica. So using costs for, they have a wind installation there at the Wigton Wind Farm. They do have some solar installations. We're taking the most recent cost estimates for new projects, and we plugged it into the model, and as you can see, wind is incredibly attractive. And solar PV, which is somewhere right here, I mean, it's not, but 20 cents isn't horrible, especially when people are already paying 38 cents per kilowatt hour. And this sort of highlights how if people sort of install solar panels on their own homes and just skip purchasing necessarily from utilities, they would actually save a lot of money over the long run. So we're just trying to use this to make the economic argument for renewable energy countries. And I do think it's easier often in island states because they pay more for electricity. And that's sort of the general idea of our sustainable energy roadmaps. I believe that for a lot of these countries, they are sort of the countries that are most ready for sort of a renewable energy revolution, and it makes the most sense for them. And if you can prove it there, then you can start moving it to, maybe it'll convince the United States or a lot of other countries to say, wow, this stuff really is economical.
Just one little add-on to this. One of the exciting things about using this model is that we're able to take some of the results of our resource assessments and plug them into this model. So like using the capacity factors that we find in areas with strong wind and solar resources, we can plug those into the model and say, if you build a wind farm here, it's really attractive and you end up with these different prices. So just kind of integrating the different parts of our analysis.
Yeah, it ties a lot of things together. That's something I forgot to mention about our resource maps. But they do provide capacity factors. And when you're talking about LCOEs for renewable energies, that is sort of the important factor. A lot of it is sort of upfront cost for renewable energies, while for traditional fossil fuel power plants, it's often sort of the marginal cost of fuel and all that that impacts prices a lot. But for renewables, it's just all up front. There's not that much, I mean, the fuel is free and all that. So the capacity factor is very key, and we do get that in our resource assessments. Next slide. So I think this is the final slide, but this sort of is where we tie it all together, and I don't know if you want to add anything about this, but we do have policy and finance suggestions. At the end of the day, we are a think tank, though we're trying to be an impact tank. But we try and sort of argue that there's some very important key things that need to be included in any type of renewable energy or energy policy in general in these countries. One of those is a very long-term vision, effective administrative structure, and concrete support policies and measures. And one thing that our director loves to say is that policies need to be loud, long, and legal. So you can't just say, oh, we want 30% renewables by 2030. That's not necessarily going to accomplish anything. But you need things that are sort of, that'll work within the government. You need ambitious policies, but you also need an administrative structure that'll accomplish those along the way. And I think that is it. Yeah, so if you want to visit our website, worldwatch.org, there's also a climate and energy blog called Revolt, where we often try and write about our roadmap work in these Caribbean countries, but then we also talk about general energy and climate issues that are going on. So